Welcome to another episode of the Plutus Awards podcast. I'm your host, Chris Browning. Our community is filled with hundreds of stories from creators and entrepreneurs just like you. And through this podcast, we plan to share these stories from bloggers to podcasters, writers, speakers, and more. If you are listening to this episode right when it released, this is the week of FinCon, so we thought it would be only appropriate to have on Philip Taylor, aka PT, the founder of FinCon.
Welcome to this episode of the Plutus Awards podcast. This week, we're excited to have Philip Taylor, also known as PT, joining us. He is the founder of FinCon, and he is the founder of ptmoney.com. So thank you so much for joining us this week.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Miranda. Happy to be chatting with you.
We kind of want to talk about your journey because you started out as a personal finance blogger. You were building your website, but then you kind of pivoted a little bit. You kind of made a shift. Can you tell us a little bit about what made you move from focusing on blogging to basically doing this year-round endeavor that is FinCon?
Yeah, so it's certainly not something I, as a youth or in college, dreamed of doing ever. Event planning and running a big conference or trade show wasn't something that I set out to do, but it was just something that came out of naturally hanging out with this great community of people that we have. And I got to do that initially because I started my own blog back in 2007. And so 3 years later, that blog became my full-time income. I pulled it off the side hustle shelf and made it my full-time thing. And so I guess I needed to put another side hustle up back on that shelf to spend my nights and weekends fiddling with. And so it really pulled me into it because, I just felt like I was gaining so much with my blog, momentum and revenue and traffic and followers because I was hanging out with these other influencers, these other creators. And so we were in forums back then and just kind of talk and shop every day. And then I would go to an occasional industry marketing conference like Affiliate Summit, and I would go to some word camps, and I would meet these other creators there, specifically in the personal finance space. And man, I just love those relationships. I could finally talk to these people about things that mattered to me that I was concerned about. No longer had to bother my wife or my parents with these details because they ultimately don't care at a certain point. But
right, and sometimes they just don't get it.
Yeah, just don't get it. And so it was out of that desire to have more of that feeling of people who get me and people to bounce ideas off of. And I really I just fell in love with this community. So one of the first things I did was build a map for people to kind of pin their location on. You can still go out there on PT Money today and see the blogger map that's out there. And we still add people every day. And this is a virtual map online that, shows people where the different personal finance bloggers are across the globe. And so I guess that was sort of one of the beginnings of it. And then also I went to New Media Expo that year before. I just had a sense that it had kind of reached its peak. And all these sort of niche blogging conferences were popping up. And so, again, that was kind of another thing that gave me a signal. Hey, this is something you can do. Now, not having any experience in event planning, I didn't just say, this is going to be a slam dunk. I knew it would be a risk. But the cool thing about events is that it's kind of like having a baby. You got 9 months to figure it out, So if you don't know, right away how to do it, you can do all the research and emulate, and I had sort of been a student of events to a degree, meaning I went to all these other conferences and I kind of knew, and every entrepreneur does this, they sort of know the things they like out of the businesses they use. And when you're building your thing, you want to take those best ideas and bring them together. And so in those early days, that's kind of how it all came together. It was, I was pulled into it by a community who I knew needed this. I was getting signals from the market that it was a good time, and I just knew I would have time to kind of figure out the details later. But just was the first to kind of raise my hand and say, hey, let's do this party,
Yeah, and I remember the first FinCon, and it really did feel like this wonderful family reunion and people that you had known online but you'd never met in person, and it was really a great experience. And there were only like 250 of us
Hmm.
maybe at that
Yeah.
first one. And I remember too, like when the announcement, like you didn't have to plan out like the whole year ahead or even 2 years ahead. Like now you know where FinCon's going to be like way out there. And I remember, us waiting like 6 months after the first FinCon, like all of us waiting, when is the next one and where is it going to be? And now, now you have to plan it out way in advance. So what were some of the growing pains that you experienced as FinCon kind of took off? Because it really has grown dramatically in the last few years.
Yeah. Yeah, lots of growing pains. To be honest with you, I mean, it was the side hustle that first year, and I was glad I did it. It wasn't on its own a great financial success, but it had a lot of indirect value for me and my brand. And so PT Money had a great year after that, which I credit to being the guy who started the industry conference. And so,
Right. And that's a good point. Just kind of a side note before we move into the growing pains. But I do like that point that you've made that sometimes these sorts of events, these sorts of things, kind of being that trailblazer can kind of put you out in front, and it has those side benefits that maybe you don't see directly from the event.
yeah, exactly. At the same time, events are a grind. And as soon as you finish one, it's like, okay, you're already starting to plan the next one. I really had a lot of respect for our community and what we had built. And so I really wanted to foster that and treat it nicely and then do a better job. That puts a lot of pressure from year to year. It's like, okay, how are you going to top that one? And it's been 9 years of that. And so that's kind of a grind. And, that was probably one of the biggest hurdles in the early years was how am I going to do this? And do I want to do it given that it was not necessarily a financial success on its face? And so I would say the biggest hurdle those first 3 years was kind of just sticking with it and believing, and I guess, somewhere down deep inside, believing that, this would eventually become something that would be a lot of fun to run or very rewarding on its face. And so other hurdles early on were just when you put together an event for a community and almost an association like we have, it's very taxing in terms of wanting to be sort of a community built event, but at the same time, like having your own vision for it as well. And so there's a natural rub there where you want to involve people as much as possible, yet you feel like you've got your vision. And so I think just balancing those two things was probably the biggest challenge early on. Was I wanted it to be community built, and I still want it to be that way. Yet there's a natural rub with, okay, I know this will make us more money, or I know this will allow us to hire a staff person, or I know this part will, allow us to bring in a bigger brand or whatever. And so just trying to keep those things in balance. Anytime you're serving a customer, you want to certainly keep their best interests at heart, but you also want to be around, in a few years. And so I think kind of keeping those things in check was a big hurdle. Also, sort of anticipating the growth, right? So after a couple of years, I sort of had a feeling of what this thing could become, but I always was very conservative with that. That was tricky from year to year. We decided to be a conference that moves around every year. So it's like you're starting all over every year, which means you have to go find the new place. You have to negotiate the new contract. You have to, do all those things. And so that became a challenge, but luckily I have some good team members with this event, and I started with them pretty early on. And I think that was an advantage of starting a business where I didn't really know a lot about it. So with my blog, I spent 3 years learning it, investing in it, bootstrapping it, and I did everything with the blog. And so it's very hard to outsource a business like that when you're the expert at it, and you feel like it's your baby. Whereas with the conference, there were so many facets of it that I had no idea about, and I didn't even want to have to learn about, and I couldn't even do it over that 9-month period. So that's when I brought in some help, along the way to kind of get me going there.
When you first started bringing in help, it was mostly volunteer. And I know that there are still plenty of volunteer opportunities at FinCon. So if you want to volunteer at FinCon, anyway, but I know there are plenty of volunteer opportunities still at FinCon, but you had to make a switch at some point to actually finding people that I mean, you had to pay them, right? You
Mm-hmm.
had to hire them as team members. So how do you do that? How do you kind of make that switch? And why is it important to know, like, at what point do you recognize that it's time to actually start paying people and hire people full time?
Yeah. Well, I think for me, it was when I felt overwhelmed and I felt like the event wouldn't be as well served if I stayed in those roles. So early on, I had a buddy kind of help me with some of the graphical design aspects of it. And even another blogger helped me, Pete from Bible Money Matters, helped me with a little bit of that. But ultimately, 2 or 3 years in, I was like, what are we doing here? We need someone to make this thing look visually a lot better than any of us can, and someone who's dedicated. And so that's when Libby, who is our creative director and our head of marketing now, essentially came in to help me out. And I started them as contractors. We have 2 full-time employees now, and I started them both as contractors. So I had Libby in year 2 or 2.5 and 3. She came in and has made our event look and feel professional, but not too professional. We don't want to be corporate. We don't want to be, but she kind of hits it right down the middle, I think, in terms of what we want to look like. We're certainly out of that campy phase that we were in early on. If you go back and look at some of our styles and designs early on, it was definitely homegrown. But
Right.
I think it's important to know kind of when you're in the way and when you can take a little more risk with bringing someone in. I brought her in on a contract basis. So, we did an independent contractor agreement, and I paid her according to the hours that she worked for me. And it was pretty easy to budget that within the system. And then Jessica is someone actually who was with me from the very start. She was actually my virtual assistant for a little bit at PT Money before even FinCon came around. And then I said, oh, well, now that I have you as a virtual assistant for this, why don't you also do some work for me over here? And so a similar thing where it was kind of an hourly rate. I gave her as much of that hotel research and vendor checking out and onboarding the sponsors, keeping up with some of the details of the conference early on. And so some of those things where I just felt like, man, if I keep spinning my wheels on these things, then the conference is going to suffer. So I need someone to kind of help me with the details. And she's really been that detailed person for me. And so early on, I kind of kept them as contractors, and that's how I treated the first 3 or 4 years of the conference, where, I brought them, they were hired guns, and I brought them in when I needed them. And that seemed to serve the event really well. And then, of course, I then asked Jessica, since you're the details person, why don't you also be the details person at the event itself and put together the staff to help with check-in, to help with any kind of arrangements that need to be made at the event itself. And so she sort of took over that phase of the conference. And that meant she also hired day contractors for the event itself. And so we went out and got 2 or 3 people to help her with check-in that we would pay just for that time period. And the same thing happened on the audiovisual side. Justin is someone I've known, and all these folks I've known from college. So
Oh, nice.
instead of necessarily going out and finding the absolute best talent out there, now granted, these people are all talented. They
I was
do a
going to say,
fantastic
let's
job.
not knock Justin and Jessica.
That's not a knock on them at all. But I took the approach of, these are people I trust. These are people I'm super comfortable with, and I know they have skills in these areas, and they're willing to kind of grow with me in this business. They've got their own jobs out there right now that they're perfectly happy with, but this could be a great supplement for them, similar to the way it was for me. So our goals aligned in that sense, and that we all had our own things going on, but we were kind of coming together to, and this is one of our values, to independently collaborate on this project. So brought in Justin as a contractor, Libby, and then Jessica. And so those have been our big 3 through the years. And it wasn't until about the 5th year, I believe, that I decided to make Jessica first a full-time employee. And that was a difficult decision, but things are changing with her situation, and she was either going to go look for another job, and then potentially her ability to work with me would be limited, or she could come in full time with me. And so the numbers just worked out right by that point with the conference, and I could afford to do that with her. There are certainly things we've overcome with regard to benefits I try to give her, or, additional aspects of full-time employment. But we worked kind of all those things out, and now she's fully employed with me, and we love it. We've also brought Libby in as full-time. We did that 6 months later. And then we also brought Justin in full time at a certain point, but now I have fired him from
Oh no.
FinCon and hired him for a new company that we built together. So it worked out best because that audiovisual role just, it never worked out to where it could be a full-time gig. So yeah, I thought best to help him build a new company. And we've created a new company where I hired him for that. And then we outsourced him for FinCon for that company. So my two businesses work together to bring him over to FinCon. So
Okay,
it's been
cool.
some interesting, it's been some interesting setups, but I've played it slow. I've worked with people I trusted, and we've been flexible along the way just to kind of meet each other where we're at.
Yeah, and you still have folks though that you still contract as well. So it's not just you and these these couple
Right.
of full-time employees running the show. So you also have some people you still contract or that you pay
Yep.
part-time. So how does that work? How do you decide on, what's the right balance of full-time versus part-time or contract work? How do you work out
Mhm.
that balance? How do you decide which jobs? I mean, you kind of talked a little bit about, this audio visual wasn't enough for a full-time job. How do you decide which positions do warrant full-time work and which ones should be outsourced or which ones should only be part-time? How do you make that decision?
That's a good question. So I think with events specifically and trade shows, they sort of naturally have their roles where you've got your sort of event management person, you've got the AV aspects, you've got your creative, and then you've got your sales. So historically, I've been the one to either with a contractor. In fact, the first year I used a contractor to help me with sales just because he was doing affiliate marketing for PT Money. And so he knew all the brands. And so he could just turn around and say, hey, by the way, we're throwing this conference. Would you guys want to, participate? So I look for people who were sort of naturally in that space already for us. We just sort of split up the duties as kind of they naturally have evolved, and I needed something to do. So sales kind of came back in my bucket at one point. And so I did sales for a while, and I took sales on as sort of a challenge. It's not something I feel like I'm naturally good at, but I am the best salesperson for the conference just because I know it the best and can speak. I'm also a member versus the rest of my team who are sort of outsiders who work for the company. But now I've again contracted with someone to do that sales aspect, and that really came out of a realization that again it was kind of holding the conference back if I was going to be the one leading all the sales effort, just because there are other people out there who are much more skilled at it, much more naturally in that zone, and their energy doesn't get as depleted like mine does when I try to go do that a lot. I'm just built a little differently. So that's one way. I just look for things where I feel like I'm holding folks back. We also just look for natural divisions within the company in terms of the work that needs to be done. And we also we just look for talented people too, though. So we've got people on our team who are contractors who we just feel like are talented individuals who want to associate with our company now. Because we've gotten to a certain size, people come to us and just say, hey, I'm doing this, but I've got some free time. Would you have any work for me to do? Or better yet, this is the best, is when they come to me and say, hey, I noticed that, you got a little bit of gap in either your marketing or your product or in your sales. Here's a gap I think I can help you fill. And so I'm all ears for those types of folks who want to bring the solution to me. But otherwise, I work with the people for the most part individually. So we typically bring them in first as a contractor. And if they are trying to pursue a full-time relationship with the company, then we will typically look for more work for them and help them kind of fill in those gaps. But they've got to be the one to really, again, this is sort of an independent collaboration here. If you want to do more with the company, then go find those things to do and start producing value there. And then we'll talk about a bigger role. So that's kind of how I've done it. I've also looked across the industry to see what other trade shows pay. So I'm shooting for a certain profit margin for my company. So in the trade show industry, it's really sweet if you can hit about 40%. And so that's kind of what I'm shooting for. And so I know typically what kind of revenue I'm going to be getting. I know typically what it's going to cost to actually produce the event in terms of hotel cost and vendor cost. And so that leaves me sort of a margin left over for overhead. And some of that I'm paying myself, but then some of that I can afford to pay employees. And so I sort of know that buffer. And so nowadays, that margin is going to have to increase if I'm going to get to bring another person in on a full-time basis. So that's kind of how I see it these days. I sort of let the P&L statement drive that decision mostly. And so we've got enough margin there, then I'll certainly bring someone in. But I really want to keep my profit margin at a good spot. That usually means that some of my full-time people are doing more than their core role, but that's kind of how we've been built from the start. So I think everyone's really comfortable with that. Small company still. So, but as we grow, that'll kind of be the rub.
Right. And so what is the next step then? You talk about, you have to keep the margins the same. Well, not the same, but you have to keep your margins really good. And I think a lot of people don't realize, they look and they see all of these big companies sponsoring this event. And they're like, you've got to be making money hand over fist. Of course, you have all the money in the world, but that's not always true, right? Because you're paying people, you're paying for venues, you're paying for, and FinCon is one of those events where, for a long time, everything was covered when you showed up. So can you kind of talk a little bit about sort of the shifting of the business model and what you need to do as your company grows to change the way you do things? And then maybe a little bit about, what's next for FinCon and what's next for this, your entrepreneurship journey?
Yeah. We certainly sought to grow the business, especially starting in year 4 at FinCon New Orleans was the year I made a noticeable change to try to expand the top line revenue of the company. And the idea there was if we're going to continue doing this, it needs to be something that's profitable and is something that's growing. Before that point, I would say we were truly like a community event in that it was pay at cost and come, and what sponsors we pick up sort of is the icing on the cake and allows us to have a few extra things at the event. And what we were doing was we're really charging the same price for a hobbyist, someone who was just getting going with their blog, and someone who was making millions with their blog. And so we felt like we were not able to kind of serve different people with different opportunities. And so we created the Pro Pass. We created like different levels for our conference. We also introduced a full-on expo hall. And so we just try to add a little more value and so then be able to increase kind of our margin. So with the trade show business specifically, the best margin is typically involved in the booths. And so the bigger we can make our trade show, the more margin we can have with that business. And so my philosophy with FinCon has been no particular company or brand or publisher owns this conference. It's a community event. And so when you come and you show up, it needs to have a feel of sort of everyone's here. That's our selling point, that everyone's there and that they can come and they can get what they need done at the conference, meaning the people they need to talk to, the companies they need to work with, they're there. So that's been kind of my underlying philosophy with the event. And so with that, we don't really give ownership of the event, particularly to one big brand or company. So we spread it out. And so that means to me, our expo hall needs to be as big as possible for as many people who want to come participate in the marketplace of FinCon. And so we've really been able to drive margins up for the event by increasing the size of our expo hall. That's something we've done. We've also, like I said, created a second level ticket, the Pro Pass, which helped to grow our revenue as well. So we feel like with a little extra effort that we're putting into pairing up brands and influencers with that extra ticket, that it adds a lot more value to those higher end attendees and then allows us to create more margin for our conference. So that's a lot of inside baseball, but it's been fun to certainly grow this business and watch it increase. But then at a certain level, economies of scale have also taken over. When you get above 2,000 people at an event, it's kind of hard not to be successful.
Right.
And so we're blessed to have that. But again, it's a business that from year to year has just been, are the people going to come back? Are the sponsors going to come back? It's not like a month-to-month business where you can sort of really feel the trend on a more real-time basis. You really need to kind of set that vision every year and fingers crossed, hope that everything kind of comes together again. And so it's that grind that I talked about at the beginning. I mean, there's a real, this is one of the most stressful jobs out there is event planning. And so I think we're reaping the rewards of 9 years of kind of going through that grind at this point. And so in terms of vision going forward, what we want to do next, that's something we're we're thinking about.
Well, I can tell you one thing. I was going to say next year it better be massive because it's the 10-year anniversary. We're all getting our hopes up, man.
Well, thank you for saying that. I am thankful for the folks like you have been involved with it all these years. And I'm thankful for the folks who have been there all 10 years or the 9 years. We've got a special community. And so I really want to make next year's event really special. And then it's our 10th year. And I know the Plutus Awards is celebrating their 10th year this year, which is super cool to have them involved with the event. And but yeah, next year is our chance at the 10-year mark. And it's given me a chance to kind of reflect again on kind of where we've come from and to really celebrate, our community some more. So that's the vision. I'm still working. You mentioned that I started this side hustle after running PT Money, but I'm still spending a lot of my time on PT Money. I still love that business. I still want to see that business succeed. And so that's kind of motivating me to continue to making this conference a conference that will serve me and my other business really well. I feel like I've got a skin in the game, just like you and all the other creators out there who continue to come to the event and look for it to be a way for them to meet the right people and do the business they need to do and just be inspired and hear the cool stories of the folks who are just starting to kind of keep this thing going, because we're all doing good work. I'm serving a community that's doing fantastic work out there and changing lives. And so I think as long as I keep that at the forefront of what we're doing, then positive things will happen. But no big plans. Nothing like starting an international version right now, or no plans to create 2 conferences like an East Coast or West Coast, nothing like that. We've got some boutique things we want to do again, like Ski FinCon. We want to kind of continue that and may have some other boutique things we're starting. We're also potentially starting an ad network within the FinCon community. And so, our conference brings together advertisers and influencers. And so we do that for 4 days a year. We wanted to maybe create an opportunity to do that on a 24/7 basis with what we're calling a marketplace. And so more information will be coming to that in the next couple of weeks. And that could be big. That could be a big piece of the business. And so we'll see what happens with that. But in terms of being a trade show organizer, I got this one beast of FinCon. We love running it. I got a good team that's kind of doing their own things and hiring their own contractors now. And so I'm totally happy with the direction of the business and just kind of enjoying the ride.
Very cool. And I have enjoyed having you as a guest today, and I'm sure the rest of our listeners have enjoyed it as well. So as we get ready to close out, could you tell us how people can learn more about FinCon and how they can maybe attend?
Yeah, go to finconexpo.com. All the details are there. Our next event is this September 4th through 7th in Washington, D.C. at the Washington Hilton. It's going to be 4 days of fun, hanging out with all the money nerds and being inspired and learning what you need to learn to take your stuff to the next level. So please join us. And if you're not necessarily a creator, we have something called our Community Pass, which is a kind of a little known secret. You can attend the event as just a general public member. Look for the Community Pass on our ticket page.
I appreciate you all joining us here for another episode, and big thanks to Miranda Marquette for taking over the interview duties today. Next week, we will be joined by Paula Pant. And if you've ever been interested in learning more about what it takes to build a course, I think you're really going to enjoy that episode. So make sure you're subscribed so that way you don't miss that episode, and more to come from the Plutus Awards podcast. You can learn more about our guests and the Plutus Awards podcast at plutusawards.com/podcast and on Instagram at Plutus Awards. Again, thanks so much for joining us, and keep creating.